the bad guy loses, and the networks say that's an indication that this is a pro-social program, is lost on children of that age, and they just don't understand that facet of child psychology.
And if I can just add, the one thing that is different in entertainment television over news television is in entertainment television, the good guys win. The good guys aren't the people who get hurt. In violence on news, which obviously is a very different thing, there we see the grim realities of violence. Dr. Houston.
Well, I think we have 40 years of history to show that the marketplace does not produce a reduction in violence, and in fact, we have the last 7 or 8 years of when there has been a great reduction in the regulatory efforts of the Federal Communication Commission and other government agencies, and in which we've had increases in violence, and we have had, I think, serious commercial exploitation of children in the program-length commercials, which are virtually all the new programs for children that have been produced on commercial television for the last 3 or 4 years.
Professor Kuby.
Yes. By and large, the marketplace brings about the kinds of things we're criticizing here today. I mean, you look at the movie industry, for example, there are people who consciously decide that we must outdo the last violent, horrific movie, lest we leave children leaving the theater saying, gee, it didn't scare me as much as the one where they ripped the heart out of the woman. I mean, they didn't do anything but rip her arm off. I mean, what kind of movie is that? So there are those kinds of marketplace forces working. What's surprising is that in the past, parents' phone calls and letters to stations, I think, had more effect. I'm amazed, for instance, the wrestling program that I described to you, that it hasn't been yanked from the air. I first saw it a number of months ago on Channel 11 in the New York area, and I couldn't believe that it survived since then. I mean, it is so gratuitous and so offensive and so sexist that I'm amazed that there haven't been enough calls to pressure that station to take it off the air. And those kinds of marketplace forces, I mean, the advertisers in the industry, they're responsive. They don't like hearing complaints. It's a very conservative industry by and large. But I'm concerned that more parents aren't more outraged and aren't going and taking some kind of action, because the networks will respond to some degree when people do take action.
Dr. Beard.
Obviously, the market is thriving, so therefore the marketplace is not the appropriate setting for checks and balances. And when I say the market is thriving, we note that the more violence that the public is shown, the more it seems to crave or demand it. You can tell by the types of programming that will be not only restated for the next season, but you can tell by which programs are selected for reruns during the summer months. And without calling specific programs, several of them are also on the affiliate or on the network, which our earlier speaker represents. So I think that without alternative programming to be available, it's a thriving market. The marketplace is not appropriate for checks and balances.
We thank you very, very much for your testimony and for your leadership. Our final panel is Professor Elmer Gertz of the John Marshall Law School, Barry Lynn, the American Civil Liberties Union, Professor David Strauss, the University of Chicago Law School, and Professor Gene Nickel, Marshall Wythe School of Law, College of William and Mary. And again, I am going to have to impose that 5-minute limitation on it.
I was chairman of the Bill of Rights Committee at the Illinois Constitutional Convention, chairman of the Section Council on Individual Rights and Responsibilities of the Illinois State Bar Association, chairman of the Civil Rights Committee of the Chicago Bar Association, and president of the First Amendment Lawyers Association. I say these things to evidence that I am devoted to constitutional rights and responsibilities. At the same time, I'm not deaf, dumb, and blind. It seems to me very obvious that there is an extraordinary amount of violence on television, and that some of it, at least, has dire results so far as the young and susceptible are concerned. For that reason, I'm strongly in favor of the bill proposed by you, Senator Simon. At the same time, I recognize that it is not the entire answer. Much more has to be done, but at least it's a start. I have filed a statement, and I'd like to emphasize only a few points from it in the interest
You bet.
of
And the
time.
full statements will be entered in the record.
Yeah. On its face, the First Amendment is absolute in its prohibition of limitations on the freedom of speech and of the press. But we have known from the very beginning that there are certain areas in which, in fact and in law, limitations can be placed upon the basic constitutional right. Defamation, certain invasions of privacy, obscenity, fraud and deceit, words coupled with conduct calculated to create dangers to the national security or public safety or health. These are among the areas in which it is readily recognized that restrictions may be imposed. In our day, there are certain menaces to the life of the community that cause us to ask what we can do about them. They include crime, violence, delinquency, drugs, dread diseases such as AIDS. I think it's clear, if we study the matter, not simply as a professor of law, but as citizens, that from the very beginning, we have recognized certain historical limitations and certain limitations by reason of necessity. And we cannot be so purist that we say that there is a problem, we can do nothing about it because of constitutional limitations. I suggest that there is no problem, the solution to which is precluded by any narrow construction of the law. Now, as I see it, the proposed legislation does not set up or encourage any system of censorship which would be forbidden by a line of cases. It's purely voluntary in nature. It simply would encourage the industry to act in a public interest, and there's absolutely no compulsion about it. I would suggest that you examine the leading case of Young versus American Mini Theaters, which I cite in my statement and from which I quote. Well, as I see it, the proposed law creates a forum for the exchange of information and ideas. And each network and station would be free to act or not act as it chose. It seems to me also that with respect to the laws with respect to competition, that the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act, and other acts have always been interpreted by the Supreme Court and other courts with the fiat that reasonableness must be applied to them. They are not so absolute and so strict that absolute necessity is precluded. As we have now, what we have now is a kind of Gresham's law in operation. The worst programs tend to drive out the best. And so we have the kind of horrible programming that we see on the air. Now, what this legislation proposed by you would do would at least give an opportunity for new looks at the situation, to arrive at guidelines, to arrive at guidance of some sort, because before the industry is the peril that the public may go too far, just as we go too far in our criminal justice system at times and become punitive rather than preventive. I think that unless there is some framework such as that suggested by you, we're likely to have much worse arrangements proposed legislatively and otherwise.
We thank you very, very much. Barry Lynn, the American Civil Liberties Union, not a stranger to these halls here. Happy to have you here.
Thank you, Senator Simon. I think it's absolutely clear from the hearings this morning that this legislation is constructed for the purpose of influencing the content of television broadcasting, and as such, it does create serious First Amendment problems. There is a strong case that without the proposed exemption to antitrust laws, the television industry would be unable to engage in concerted action to produce a homogeneously reduced level of violence in broadcasting. Except for this act, no concerted decisions about violence are likely to occur. The proposed exemption would specifically allow the television industry to regulate violent content, but not other content. It does not provide a blank check for concerted action in the television industry, but only promotes the singular goal of regulating television violence, at least that with some still amorphous negative effects. It represents governmental action which disadvantages some communications but not others. The messages which might be disadvantaged could include those suggesting that violence and aggression are either an acceptable or an unacceptable way to solve problems, or that violence is a natural fact of life, or even that viewing violence is an appropriate form of entertainment. In this way, this bill does engender a form of constitutionally forbidden viewpoint discrimination. My concern also is that if this exemption is enacted this year by this Congress, what congressional suggestions through exemption will we see next year? Will we see suggestions to encourage guidelines to alleviate the effect of positive views of abortion, or guidelines to promote a positive image of the Contras? I think there's a very serious precedent to be set by this exemption, which does represent governmental influence upon the viewpoints which will be presented by the media. Governmental influence or control over the content of protected speech is not made less offensive to the First Amendment because that control is indirect or informal. In Bantam Books versus Sullivan, a Rhode Island Commission on Juvenile Delinquency notified distributors of certain materials that those materials had been found by a majority of the Commission to be objectionable for sale to young people. But the Commission did not take any formal action to prohibit the sale. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court viewed this informal action as unconstitutional, noting we are not the first court to look through forms to the substance, and recognize that informal censorship may sufficiently inhibit the circulation of publications to warrant injunctive relief. That was the same case Bantam Books heavily relied upon in the Playboy Enterprises versus Me suit, where an injunction was granted after the Ed Meese Pornography Commission sent letters to many of America's retailers and hotel chains saying that they might be identified in a report as purveyors of pornography, and that possible characterization, even though informal by a government agency, certainly raised the specter of something very unpleasant for those corporations, and they did act in such a way as to avoid that label. Like the actions of the Rhode Island Delinquency Commission or of Ed Meese's Pornography Commission, this bill in its way provides the same kind of intimidating prospect. We have the prospect not only of passing this bill and sending this signal, but then the prospect of further oversight hearings to create palpable government pressure to alter the content of materials broadcast to the public. If the television industry were to establish industry-wide guidelines regarding violence on the basis of this bill, those regulations would be legally permissible only because of this exemption. And in fact, the industry promulgated guidelines would be so related to and dependent upon state action that they could readily be construed as government action for constitutional purposes under decisions like Burton versus the Wilmington Park Authority. Broadcasters, I must add, are not the only ones affected in their First Amendment rights by this bill. A collaterally affected group would be the creators and producers of televised material with violent content. As the market for their material becomes subject to regulation, they would be forced to either alter the content of their productions, even if they felt there was a legitimate artistic purpose for inclusion of substantial violence, or withdraw from the market. Unpleasant, unpopular speech, as well as the speech we favor, is safeguarded by the First Amendment. There is no precedent for excluding depictions of violence from full First Amendment coverage. Support for this bill obviously is founded on the assumption that exposure to television violence does cause antisocial aggressive behavior. I think the available evidence on this topic is, to say the least, inconclusive on many levels and should not provide the basis for this kind of congressional action. The danger, though, goes beyond that.
If you can conclude.
I will summarize this. Acceptance of a principle here that speech should be restricted based on its effect on even a few viewers entails a very dangerous backsliding in First Amendment analysis. If the measure of suppression becomes what one or two adults or children might do in response to particular speech, whether that's violent programming or the report on the news of a violent act like a suicide, then we all become reduced to sitting in darkened rooms in order to prevent violent images from crossing the eyes or minds of even the most suggestible viewer. Make no mistake about it. I recognize, Senator Simon, your deep commitment to the First Amendment and to its principles. But this bill, in our view, does amount to censorship by intimidation. The networks, the cable operators, the motion picture industry, I believe, know that the sole purpose of this bill is to change the content of what Americans see. And if this change would occur through normal social forces, fine, but when it occurs through the veiled, even the veiled threats of government, then it is destructive, in our view, to the very principles of a free and open society. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lynn. Professor Strauss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm David Strauss. I teach constitutional law at the University of Chicago Law School. It is my view that this bill would be constitutional if it were enacted. That's a view I reach with some reluctance and some hesitation because of the concerns raised by Mr. Lynn, but on balance, I think this bill would be constitutional. I can summarize the reasons for that shortly, and then I will mention why I think it is
You want to
somewhat
pull your microphone just a little closer to you there.
Sure. The first thing to note about this bill is that it has nothing to do with political speech in any sense. It doesn't in any way suppress any distinctive political view or any category of political speech. Other speech besides political speech is, of course, protected by the First Amendment, but for a long time it's been thought that political speech was at the core of the First Amendment, and the fact that this bill does not touch anything political is a strong point in its favor. The second, as Mr. Gertz emphasized, this bill is not in any sense coercive. It doesn't force the networks to do anything whatever. It leaves them free to go their own way. Not only are they free from government coercion, but the bill and the legislative history of the comparable bill introduced in the last Congress suggests that make it clear that private coercion is not to be tolerated and is not to come within the antitrust exemption. In fact, there is a sense in which this bill even promotes First Amendment interests. There are two senses in which I think that is true. First, as a number of witnesses have pointed out this morning, in the current environment, television networks are operating under a form of coercion. It's a form of market coercion, a form of competitive pressure that may prevent them from showing the sort of programming they would like to show. That's a very real form of coercion, and if Congress acts to eliminate that form of competitive pressure and free the networks to show what they would like to show, an argument can be made that that actually advances First Amendment interests by freeing them to speak in a way that competition does not allow them to speak. Second, it shouldn't be overlooked that what this bill literally does is to authorize speech. It authorizes speech among network executives about a matter of extreme public importance, television violence. That is what it literally does. Now, speech among competitors in a context that could produce an antitrust violation is not traditionally protected by the First Amendment, but nonetheless it shouldn't be overlooked that what will be going on here is speech. Third, there is a tradition of regulating the electronic media, radio and television, to a much greater extent than the print media. This bill, of course, concentrates on the electronic media. And finally, there is an established principle that the government's power to regulate the broadcasts, particularly electronic media broadcasts to which children are exposed, is much greater. And to the extent that the bill is designed to allow the networks to develop guidelines for dealing with programming directed at children, I think the arguments for its constitutionality are much enhanced. I should say it's not at all clear from the face of the bill that it is directed specifically at children, but to the extent that it is, that's a powerful argument in its defense. The reason I have some hesitation about saying that this bill is constitutional is that, as Mr. Lynn very forcefully said, it is discriminatory. Violence on TV, as distasteful as many of us, including me, find it, is protected by the First Amendment. When speech is protected by the First Amendment, that means not only that the government can't prohibit it, it also means that there are limits on the extent to which the government can discriminate against it by giving people benefits if they don't engage in it. And that's what's going on here, and that's a real constitutional problem. For the government to have free rein to give benefits to those who engage in speech it approves and withhold them from those who engage in speech it disapproves is a troubling prospect. But not all forms of discrimination are unconstitutional. There are many forms of discrimination. I described them in my prepared statement by the government that are permitted, and for the reasons I gave, I think this kind of enactment is sufficiently unthreatening to core First Amendment values to survive constitutional scrutiny.
I thank you very much. Professor Nickel.
Chairman Simon, my name is Gene Nickel. I'm a law professor at the College of Wood. Despite the fact that I think this bill is constitutional, I agree with much of what Barry Lynn said about the bill. I think that even though it's voluntary, it certainly is government action, which is subject to review under the First Amendment. And it's government action which is content-based in its nature, which means for First Amendment purposes, it's among the most serious sort of enterprises in terms of constitutional review. I simply want to add, and this is set forth more fully in my statement, that there is a line of cases, present Supreme Court doctrine, which I won't describe here, but I think are familiar, at least to you and certainly the members of the panel. Young against American Mini Theaters, decided in 1976. FCC against Pacifica, decided in 1978. And City of Renton against Playtime Theaters, which was decided just last year, which indicate that under present Supreme Court doctrine, I think the case is virtually overwhelming that this statute would be constitutional. Those cases indicate that certain regulations, especially regulations of expression, even though content-based regulations of expression, especially those which involve the electronic media, and relate to what the court has characterized in those three cases as low-level speech, are constitutional if they are, quote, narrowly tailored to further a substantial government interest. I think that 844, if challenged, would fall under this Young line of cases for a number of reasons. First of all, as has been indicated, like Pacifica, it applies to electronic media, and you know the whole argument concerning scarcity, therefore allowing greater regulation to the electronic media. Secondly, although this is